Alright, so we just got a new video request from someone asking us, what are some of Yellowstone's minor eruptions? Well, I figured this was a good question because just recently there has been a fairly large swarm of earthquakes near Yellowstone, which means it must be due for an eruption. So what could that possibly mean? And also, can we predict when the next supervolcano eruption might occur? Because let me tell you, it won't be pretty if and when this happens. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we'll start by answering the first part of our question, what are Yellowstone's minor eruptions? But then at the end, we'll cover the second part of the question. Can we really predict when the next Yellowstone super eruption will happen? Let's begin. But anyway, before we get into this topic, if you've ever wondered what a magma chamber actually is, how does it work? Where do they come from? And why don't these things break through the Earth's crust and cause massive magma floods all over the planet? Now, this is a great question. You should check out this video we did earlier this year. Okay, now back to the video. So the first thing you need to know about Yellowstone is that there are 3 different calderas. So this map shows each of them along with their approximate depths and also the magnitudes of their historical eruptions. For example, the Huckleberry Ridge eruption was nearly 2,000 cubic kilometers in volume. That's about 480 billion gallons, and it occurred around 2 million years ago. The Mesa Falls eruption was only about 80 cubic kilometers in volume, or 20 billion gallons, and this happened around 1.3 million years ago. And finally, the Lava Creek event was about 50 cubic kilometers, or 12 billion gallons, and this occurred around 640,000 years ago. And these are called the 3 largest known eruptions in Earth history. Yellowstone's most recent eruption began around 630,000 years ago with the formation of the Lava Creek caldera. It continued erupting until about 70,000 years ago when the current Yellowstone supervolcano formed. These events are considered the Yellowstone super eruption. If you want to hear more about that, check out some of our other videos. We covered it in more detail in a couple of them. But now we're going to focus on the minor eruptions. Now we define minor eruptions as anything that occurs within the borders of the current Yellowstone supervolcano. So here are the 5 most recent eruptions that fit this description. And notice how they all occurred very close together. The first one is the Fremont Caldera. This is also known as the Fremont eruption. It had a volcanic explosivity index, or VEI, of 6, and it happened about 13,000 years ago. The magma chamber that created this structure was located quite deep underneath the current supervolcano. It was about 9 kilometers beneath the surface. The erupted volume was somewhere between 180 and 300 cubic kilometers, or 40 and 66 billion gallons. This eruption left behind a huge depression that was about 50 kilometers across, and today it's home to the Upper Geyser Basin, which is famous for its beautiful geysers and hot springs. Next, we have the Black Sand Basin eruption. This took place 12,600 years ago, and it had a VEI of 3. It also originated in a magma chamber that was quite deep, about 7 kilometers below the surface. The eruption volume was only about 2.7 cubic kilometers, or 6.6 billion gallons. And this resulted in the formation of a small maar. A maar is a type of volcanic crater that is formed by a steam explosion. They often look like rings and can be filled with water. There are many of them throughout the world. In fact, the world's largest maar is located in Germany. It's called Lacher See. Moving on, we have the Obsidian Pool eruption. This happened 12,500 years ago and also had a VEI of 3. Its magma chamber was much closer to the surface. It was only 3.7 kilometers beneath the surface. The volume was similar to the previous eruption, about 2.8 cubic kilometers, or 6.7 billion gallons, and it also formed a small maar that is still there today. Next, we have the Wagner Basin eruption. This one happened about 12,200 years ago and had a VEI of 3. Its magma chamber was similar to the last one. It was only 3.2 kilometers below the surface. The volume was a little bigger than the previous 2 eruptions. It was about 4.1 cubic kilometers, or 9.7 billion gallons, and once again, it created another small maar. And finally, we have the most recent minor eruption at Yellowstone. It's called the Lava Creek event. It happened around 12,000 years ago and also had a VEI of 3. Once again, the magma chamber was relatively shallow. It was only 2.4 kilometers beneath the surface. The volume was similar to the previous eruptions. It was about 3.9 cubic kilometers or 9.4 billion gallons. And this one also formed a small maar. Now, if you've noticed a pattern here, you're not mistaken. Most of Yellowstone's minor eruptions are small steam explosions that form small maars. Why is that? Well, this is due to the fact that Yellowstone is mostly made up of a pile of solid rock. It's not like a typical stratovolcano that has alternating layers of ash and lava. Instead, it's more like a thick soup of melted rock that's slowly congealed over time. As a result, there are many places in the park where magma is literally only a few feet below the surface. When steam and groundwater come into contact with this magma, it can cause massive explosions. Even a small amount of magma can produce a lot of steam, which is why these eruptions tend to be pretty big compared to their size. Also, the reason why there are so many of these small eruptions is because the magma chambers that feed them are relatively small compared to the supervolcano. And speaking of small magma chambers, that brings us to the next part of the question. Can we really predict when the next Yellowstone supereruption will occur? The answer is maybe. Scientists have been studying this for decades, and they've identified several indicators that could potentially give us some warning. For example, one of the things they look for are changes in the frequency and size of earthquakes. Since 1985, there have been about 2,000 earthquakes in the Yellowstone region. Most of them have been pretty small, but there have been a few big ones, like the magnitude 7.3 event that occurred in 1985. It's the largest earthquake that's ever hit the contiguous United States. Scientists think that there's a correlation between earthquakes and magma movement, so they use this data to try to figure out where the magma chambers are and how big they are. Another thing scientists look for are changes in the shape of the land. For example, in 2012, scientists detected that the ground around Yellowstone's caldera had uplifted by about 1.5 centimeters. This may not sound like a lot, but it's actually enough to trigger a bunch of minor earthquakes. Scientists aren't sure if this was caused by magma movement or just normal tectonic activity. However, it's definitely something they'll keep an eye on in the future. Scientists also look for changes in the amount of heat coming off of Yellowstone. For example, between 2001 and 2015, they noticed that the amount of heat coming off of the ground had increased by about 10%. This may not sound like a lot, but it's actually enough to melt about 150 million tons of rock per year. They aren't sure if this is caused by magma movement or just natural fluctuations in geothermal activity. However, it's definitely something they'll keep an eye on in the future. And finally, scientists also look for changes in the gases coming out of Yellowstone's vents. Between 2004 and 2015, they noticed that the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the vents had increased by about 40%. They aren't sure if this is caused by magma movement or just natural fluctuations in volcanic activity. However, it's definitely something they'll keep an eye on in the future. In conclusion, we really don't know when the next Yellowstone supereruption will occur. Some scientists think it'll happen in our lifetime. Others think it won't happen for tens of thousands of years. But the truth is, we just don't know. The best thing we can do is keep an eye on all the data and hope for the best. Now, this is a pretty serious topic, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think we're going to have another major eruption at Yellowstone, or do you think everything's fine? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching. I'm a volcanologist, and this is our channel. And remember, if this video helped you learn something new today, please consider sharing it with your friends. And if you're not already subscribed, please do. And we'll see you next time.